The dawn came slowly over the Normandy hedgerows, bleeding a dull grey light across the rolling fields. The air still carried the cold bite of a June night, laced with the sour smell of damp earth and ruptured foliage left behind by the previous day's barrage. Atop a low ridge, nothing more than a rise of chalky soil crowned with a thin line of hedges, a single Sherman Firefly sat nearly motionless, its long 17-pounder barrel stretching out like a silent accusation toward the valley below. Inside the turret, the stale smell of cordite lingered from Test firing the gun the previous evening. Sergeant William Bill Harper, the tank's gunner, blinked against the sting in his eyes as he pressed his cheek once more against the cool metal of the sight housing. He adjusted the elevation wheel slow and deliberate, listening to the faint creak of gears, the Firefly's own quiet breathing at the edge of battle. The valley ahead was still cloaked in low morning mist. But shapes were beginning to take form: tree lines, farmhouses, fence lines fractured by shellfire, and further still, just beyond the curve of a distant hedgerow movement, the distant grind of heavy engines, deep and rhythmic, rolled up the hillside like thunder from a far-off storm. Harper did not need the commander to tell him what that sound meant. Since landing in Normandy with the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, they had been chasing rumors of the same armored formation for days. Elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, and moving to reinforce Keene after days of brutal fighting. The German panzers were delaying every British advance counter, punching at dusk and dawn, slipping through the maze of orchards and bocage with practiced confidence. But this time, through a convergence of luck, geography, and a single raised ridge, the Firefly crew had the advantage. Harper wiped his hand across the sight lens. To the left, Lieutenant Aldridge, the tank commander, stood half exposed in the open turret hatch, field glasses raised. His silhouette was stark against the brightening sky, lean, still controlled. In the hull, Corporal Mac McAllister handled the radio with one hand while keeping the engine idling low. Loader Private Eric Finch sat tense beside Harper, one hand resting on the first 17-pounder, shell its long brass casing glinting faintly in the half-light. "Contact," Armour Aldridge murmured, voice low but steady. "Multiple vehicles. Northeast tree line near the broken stone wall." Harper leaned into the sight. At first there was only mist, then a shifting shadow, then another, and finally, like steel ghosts emerging through fog, the 1st Panzer Roman. 4 rumbled into view. Turret turned slightly as it advanced along the field track. "Range?" Harper asked. "Marked hedge to target." 1,200 yards, Aldridge replied. "Maybe a shade more. Finch AP ready." Finch slid the shell into the breach with a practiced motion, the heavy metal clunk echoing in the cramped turret. Harper exhaled slowly. 1,200 yards. Extreme range for tank-on-tank fighting in bocage country. At that distance, timing, terrain, and fate all mingled into something like chance. But Harper had hit moving targets at that range before. He trusted the Firefly's long gun, trusted the balance of the chassis, trusted the cold calculations he had practiced again and again until they became instinct. What he did not trust was the gunsight. It had been off since the day they received the Firefly, barely perceptible at short range, but stretched at long distance. The misalignment pushed the horizontal line just low and right. The armorer had not been able to fix it in the limited downtime they ever had. He promised to sort it out after the keen push. Harper had learned to compensate, but it was always a gamble, a twist more on elevation, a fraction left on traverse, and most importantly, faith that his instincts honed from years behind the pre-war, 2-pounders and 6-pounders would overcome the fault of worn glass and hurried factory machining. He adjusted the wheel. The reticle floated over the Panzer Roman 4's silhouette. The German turret was turning slow, searching, unaware that a Firefly's barrel was already locked onto it from a ridge they had not yet scouted. Other German shapes began emerging behind it, another Panzer Roman 4, then a third spaced evenly along the farm track, advancing in line toward the British positions around St. Martin-des-Bessèges. "Steady," Bill Aldridge murmured. We engage when they're fully clear of the hedge. The valley held its breath. The mist thinned enough for sunlight to skim across the leading panzer's glacis, plate a fleeting spark of brightness against grey steel. Harper centered the reticle on that point. The Firefly felt still, too still, as if waiting like a predator coiled behind brush. "Driver brakes locked," Aldridge whispered. The Firefly settled deeper into the ridge. Behind, Harper Finch waited with another shell in hand, ready to load the instant the breach opened. Mac had gone silent. On the radio, other units were reporting armor sightings over muddled static, but none had the vantage this ridge offered. Aldridge lowered his binoculars. Gunner on. Harper's world narrowed to the sight, the reticle, the faint tremble in the German tank's suspension as it rolled forward. Fire. The Firefly roared, an eruption of metal and flame that punched through the turret walls like a blast of heated wind. The recoil hammered back into Harper's shoulder as the long barrel thrust rearward, spent gases venting through the turret in a rush of bitter smoke. Through the clearing haze, Harper watched the shell streak downrange. Then at 1,200 yards, just as the Panzer Roman 4 turned its turret toward a distant orchard, the round struck. A flash, a burst of black smoke. The turret lurched upward, then sagged as flame poured from the commander's cupola. "Hit," Aldridge said, voice controlled but tight. Loader, Finch was already moving. The second shell clanged into the breach. But even as Harper dialed in for the next target, he saw the faint telltale shift in the sight alignment. Even with the first hit, the misaligned reticle had drifted a fraction more than before. The second Panzer Roman 4 began to accelerate, crew scrambling to understand where the shot had come from. The third tank behind a ruined stone wall revved its engine hard. Harper's fingers tightened on the elevation wheel. He could compensate. He had to compensate, because down in the valley the Germans had begun to fan out, and this ridge, this single moment of advantage, was about to become the only thing keeping the British line from being crushed at dawn. The second shot left the Firefly with a deeper crack than the first, sharper, angrier, as if the barrel itself understood the urgency now descending into the valley. Harper barely registered the recoil. His focus was fixed on the shifting German formation, below the blooming smoke of the first kill, peeling away as wind rolled across the fields. The second Panzer Roman 4 jerked left, accelerating toward a hedgerow that offered concealment. It was a natural instinct: take cover, break, visual contact, identify the source of enemy fire. But the very movement exposed the side of its turret, and Harper tracked that silhouette with calm precision. He already knew the reticle sat low right at 1,200 yards. He had to aim a shade high and a hair left, centering the cross hairs on a point that felt wrong, but was right, built from an instinct sharpened by years in the gunner's seat. Through the flawed glass he measured speed, angle, and range by feel alone, like a violinist correcting a warped string, not by sight but by ear. Target acquired, Harper murmured. Aldridge stood high in the hatch, binoculars braced against his face, scanning for more armor that might slip through the mist. Send it. The round punched out. A second streak of light arced across the valley, slicing through morning haze, and struck the Panzer just behind the commander's cupola. The turret blew open. A slab of armor plate shot upward like a steel coffin lid hurled into the air. 2 German crewmen tumbled out, silhouettes briefly visible in firelight before collapsing onto the turf. "Hit confirmed," Aldridge said, lowering the glasses. There was no triumph in his voice, just the flat acknowledgement of men doing necessary lethal work. Finch loaded the next shell. Sweat darkened his collar despite the morning chill. "App in." Mac broke radio silence. "Reports from C Squadron, they're engaging Panthers near the orchard. They're getting hammered." Aldridge exhaled. Of course they are. Because that was the truth of Normandy. For every Firefly with a 17-pounder, there were 3 Shermans armed with the shorter 75 solid for infantry support, catastrophically outmatched by German heavy armor. The only things giving the British parity were moments like this one. high ground concealment and a long gun in steady hands. Gunner third tank is reversing, Aldridge warned. Harper had already swung the turret. The 3rd Panzer Roman, 4 hiding behind the ruined stone wall, was pulling back. Only the upper hull remained visible above the rubble. It was a smaller target than the others, narrower, partially obscured, fading in and out of view as the morning haze shifted. But the misaligned sight made the shot trickier still. A clean vertical mark on the lens, one of the scratches that had slowly grown worse since landing, cut through the reticle's left edge. A lesser gunner might have blinked, repositioned, or second-guessed. Harper didn't. He'd spent so many hours fighting this sight that its flaws had become part of him. He knew its bias the way a veteran pilot knows a plane with a drifting compass. He read the scratch like an extra reference point instead of a hindrance. "Loader," AP Harper said. Loaded. He breathed slowly, steadying against the Firefly's turret ring. He felt the tank below him, the vibrations in the hull, the faint rattle of the engine, the almost imperceptible list caused by the incline of the ridge. Every sensation mattered. He adjusted elevation 2 clicks higher than normal, then traversed 1 notch left, then another, compensating for the valley crosswind. Fire. The Firefly recoiled viciously as another 17-pounder round shot out toward the wall. For a split second it appeared to miss, striking low, kicking up a shower of stone fragments. But the fragments cut into the Panzer's exposed radiator vents, penetrating into the engine compartment. The German tank belched smoke, then flame. The crew bailed, 3 men scrambling over the side as fire engulfed the rear hull. Harper didn't wait to celebrate. He was already shifting to the next threat. 3 knocked out, Aldridge confirmed. But more coming. Across the valley, the haze finally lifted enough to reveal the full formation. What had looked like a handful of tanks was turning into a spearhead, an entire platoon of armor with infantry half-tracks following behind. At least 4 more Panzer Roman 4s were advancing in staggered formation, fanning wider across the open ground as they searched for firing positions. The ridge was still concealed, but not for long. The Germans had learned that the fire was coming from the high ground, they just hadn't pinpointed where on it yet. Mac called out from the hull. New radio intercepts German armor trying to flank left. Panzer grenadiers dismounting. Harper saw it too. A panzer broke formation and veered toward a hedgerow that curved up the slope near a sunken farm road. If that tank reached the bend, it could come up behind the ridge and fire directly into the Firefly's weaker rear armor. Aldridge turned sharply. "Driver, back us down 10 yards. Keep the gun on target." Mac eased the Firefly back, treads grinding softly over chalk and root. The movement dropped their profile behind a thicker gorse patch. Only the gun barrel and a sliver of turret remained visible. Gunner Aldridge said, voice tightening, that flanker must not get past the hedgerow. Harper found the new target. It was moving fast, turret swinging left to right as it scanned for threats. Range 900 yards and closing, angle shallow slightly downward. The misaligned sight shifted the reticle even worse at reduced range, drifting a fraction left on horizontal traverse. Harper compensated instinctively. Loader, up. He tracked the Panzer's vision, slit the slight shimmer on its glacis where dew still clung to steel. He fired. The round struck the base of a tree trunk by the hedgerow, showering the tank in splinters. The German driver panicked, braking too hard, causing the tank to skid. It twisted sideways just enough to expose the left side turret. Loader again. Harper snapped. Finch slammed another AP round into the breach. Harper fired before Aldridge even issued the order. This time the 17-pounder hit flush straight through the turret ring. The Panzer's turret locked, instantly jammed at a twisted angle. Smoke spilled from the seams, then flames. "That's 4," Aldridge whispered. But even with their success, Harper felt a gnawing truth forming at the base of his gut. The Germans were adjusting. More armor was pushing on the flanks, and their ridge, once a hidden sanctuary, was about to become the focal point of the enemy's fury. The Firefly had announced itself, and now every surviving panzer in the valley was turning toward the ridge, ready to kill the British tank that had struck from the mist like a phantom gun. The valley had awakened fully now. What had begun under the hush of dawn was transforming into a pitched armored confrontation, steel grinding against the still soft fields of Normandy. Smoke from the burning panzers crawled upward in long black tongues, darkening the mid-morning sky. The Firefly's turret stank of spent propellant engine fumes and sweat. Yet the crew worked with that grim, practiced cadence born of repetition and fear woven together. Harper's cheek remained pressed against the gunsight. The metal was warm now from the heat of firing from the summer air, from his own breath fogging the housing. The tiny chips on the edge of the glass distorted the world in microscopic ways, turning distant hedgerows into jagged lines, and the glint of moving armor into fractured light. But to Harper, every flaw had become familiar. He knew how the lower left edge pinched the image. He knew how the right side distortion pulled the reticle just off true at long range. And he knew most importantly that the misalignment grew slightly worse as the turret heated adrift, barely noticeable to the eye, but disastrous if unaccounted for in the chaos of battle. The Firefly's armor groaned as Mac shifted them further down the ridge, tucking their hull behind the chalk scarp. Only the gun barrel remained cleanly exposed, now concealed well enough that the Germans below still struggled to locate their exact position. Aldridge scanned the field again, 4 knocked out, but 2 more on the right have line of sight on our ridge. They're ranging us. He didn't need to say what that meant. German optics were among the best in the world. A veteran tank crew could pick up a glint from sun on glass or the flicker of muzzle smoke and zero in within moments. Harper steadied the sight. 1 Panzer Roman 4 was creeping forward along the tree line, using the foliage to mask its turret. Another advanced more boldly, cutting across open ground with its gun, elevated an attempt to spot the muzzle flash from the Firefly's next shot. Finch loaded another AP round. Ready, Harper ignored the tanks for a moment. He focused on something smaller, more important, the edge of the reticle, that faint shimmer where the scratch across the sight caught the light. It had shifted subtly. The turret's heat had begun to expand the metal frame. He whispered to himself 1/2 millimeter low. 1 left. Gunner, Aldridge asked. Sights drifting, Harper said. I can compensate. Aldridge didn't question him. Trust in a tank crew was like trust in a lifeboat's hull absolute, because anything less would sink them all. Target, rightmost panzer, the one crossing open ground. Harper found it instantly. It was angling for position, trying to work around the burning wrecks of its companions. Its commander stood partially exposed in the cupola binoculars, scanning the ridge. Range 850, Harper said. Send it. Harper aimed high left of center mass, an aim point that looked wrong to anyone unfamiliar with the Firefly's flawed optics. He paused only long enough for a breath to settle in his chest, then fired. The shot screamed out across the field, cutting a white line through drifting smoke. It hit the Panzer's turret faceplate with a clang that echoed across the valley. Armor cracked. Sparks burst like a flashbulb. The turret rocked but did not fail. Loader, clank up. Harper adjusted. The scratch across the lens seemed to warp slightly as the turret heat grew. The second shot needed even more compensation. He fired. This time the round struck true lower left hull just above the track. A geyser of sparks erupted, followed by the violent burst of spalling inside the tank. The Panzer jerked to a halt, turret sagging lifelessly. 5, Aldridge whispered, but there was no triumph left. The strain of the morning's duel weighed on them. Every shot drained something: time, ammunition, attention, luck. Harper swung to the next threat. The second remaining Panzer IV was edging along the trees, rotating its turret toward the ridge with absolute certainty. Its commander had finally spotted the muzzle flash. They had a bead on the Firefly. Driver reversed 2 meters. Aldridge barked. Mac shifted them back. The German gun fired. The high-velocity round tore through the ridge crest where the Firefly's turret had been seconds earlier. Soil and stones exploded into the turret, dusting Harper's arms in chalk grit. Finch flinched as pebbles clattered off the ammo racks. "They've got us," Mac said from below. "No," Harper murmured. "Not yet." He pinned the Panzer in the sight. It was well hidden, only the upper turret visible through slats in the hedgerow. A near impossible shot, at long range, with a misaligned sight, with a gun tube already scorching hot from repeated firing. Finch whispered, "AP loaded." Harper breathed in. The gunsight shimmered slightly. Sweat dripped from his brow onto the traverse wheel. He calculated the angle, the drift, the heat's effect on the reticle, the slight crosswind pushing from their left, the German tank's speed slow but deliberate. Distance over 1,000 yards now. He shifted one more hair to the left. "Steady," Aldridge murmured. Harper exhaled. Fire. The Firefly bucked. For a long second all was smoke. Then the haze cleared enough to see the German tank. Frozen turret shaking violently from the internal shock. A plume of fire burst from the loader's hatch. The tank bellowed black smoke. Aldridge's voice was barely above a whisper. 6. Mac let out a low breath. Finch closed his eyes for the briefest moment, hands still gripping the next shell. But Harper didn't stop. He was scanning again, watching for movement, tracking threats before they appeared. Because he could sense it, their advantage was slipping. Ammunition was running low. German infantry had begun pushing through the forested flank. Radio reports spoke of more armor 2 kilometers away. And yet in the center of the valley, partially concealed by a stone barn, another Panzer IV lurked, one they hadn't seen before. It slowly edged forward, revealing itself for only a second. Long enough. Aldridge saw it too. "Harper, that's your 7th. Harper adjusted the sight. The flaw was the worst. Now it pulled so sharply that the reticle sat visibly off-center. A lesser gunner would have missed cleanly. But Harper had grown accustomed to the imperfection. He adjusted, and then adjusted more and more, until everything looked wrong but felt right. Loader, AP in, he fired. The 7th German tank erupted behind the barn, flames blooming violently through its front armor. Aldridge lowered his binoculars. 7 tanks, at over 1,000 yards. Harper didn't answer. He kept scanning, because the battlefield was still shifting, still alive, still hungry. And he knew the next minutes would decide whether the Firefly survived the day or vanished from history like the countless crews who never lived long enough to tell their story. The 7th Panzer's burning silhouette cast a flickering orange pulse across the valley floor. The wind carried the smell of scorched rubber and ruptured fuel, mingling with the damp scent of Normandy soil. The Firefly lay half hidden on the ridge, its barrel still hot enough to shimmer in the air, its crew breathing in short controlled bursts as if exhaling too loudly might betray their position. But the calm was an illusion. The Germans were not finished. Harper knew it the way a hunter knows the woods before an ambush, by the strange heavy quiet that settles right before violence returns. The smoke, drifting through the fields, began to move, oddly bending around something unseen. A shift of weight, a rumble beneath the ground, and then Aldridge's voice cut through the turret. Movement left flank, armor, and half-tracks. Max stiffened. Finch gripped the next shell harder than necessary. Through the gunsight, Harper saw them, shadowed shapes advancing from the tree line farther southwest. It's the Firefly's crew hadn't accounted for earlier. These weren't Panzer IVs. Their silhouettes were boxier, longer. Armored half-tracks SD, KFZ, 251s packed with Panzer Grenadiers. A counter-assault force moving swiftly, smartly, using the ridge's blind angle to approach with minimal exposure. And behind them, still half-shrouded in shade, a turret. Broad, sloped, unmistakably predatory, a panther, Harper's chest tightened. The 17-pounder could kill a panther, but not easily, not at range, not from the front, not with a sight drifting worse by the minute. And if the panther reached a firing position, the Firefly's lighter armor wouldn't survive the opening shot. Aldridge ducked halfway back into the cupola, voice urgent but controlled. If they get that panther into hull-down position, we're done. Gunner, priority on the half-tracks. Keep that infantry off our flank. Harper pivoted. The first half-track burst from the tree line, its machine gun sweeping wildly at the ridge. Tracers whipped into the brush around them, sparking off stone and biting into earth. Loader he, Harper snapped. Finch scrambled for a high explosive round. The casing clanged into the breech with frantic speed. He up. Harper aimed low, adjusting past the sight's leftward pull. He didn't wait for an order, he fired as soon as the reticle settled. The shell detonated against the 251's front axle. The half-track flipped sideways in a fountain of flame and mud, spilling men into the grass. The survivors scrambled for cover, too shocked to return organized fire. Next, Aldridge balked. Another carrier burst forward, its infantry dismounting before it reached the ridge base. German rifles cracked. Bullets hissed overhead. One struck the Firefly's turret ring with a metallic ping. Ap or he, Finch yelled. He, Harper replied. He fired again. The second half-track erupted, its rear doors blown off entirely. Men crawled away, some disappearing into a ditch, others lying still. But the chaos had cost them time. Harper swung the barrel back toward the panther, just in time to see it clearing the last row of trees. Panther, 1,100 yards, he said, breath catching. Angle is front on. Aldridge cursed under his breath. We need a flank. Driver, rotate 10 degrees right. Mac eased the Firefly, sliding the hull subtly along the ridge line to give Harper a shallow view of the Panther's turret side. It wasn't enough. The Panther halted, half obscured by a sunken embankment, perfect hull-down position. Its long 75mm gun locked upward, searching. Harper steadied the sight. The Panther's turret face glinted dull steel, catching the morning light. The misaligned reticle quivered as heat distortion bent the image inside the lens. Finch whispered, AP loaded. Harper took a slow breath. The Panther fired. The crack split the valley like a whip. A round screamed past the Firefly, missing the turret by meters, shattering chalk behind them. Soil blasted into the air, raining dust over the crew. Mac ducked instinctively. Finch flinched. Aldridge steadied himself by grabbing the cupola rim. Gunner, he called. This is our only chance. Harper fired. The Firefly shook. Through the haze of smoke he strained to see had he hit. The Panther's turret jerked slightly. A faint spark flashed near the mantlet, but no smoke, no fire. The round had bounced. Loader, AP, Harper snapped. Finch slammed another shell home, breath ragged. Up. The Panther had found its mark now. Its gun lowered, aiming more precisely. They were seconds from death. Harper adjusted the reticle to compensate for the drift more dramatically than before. He aimed not at the Panther's turret, but at the narrow slit between mantlet and front plate. A shot only a marksman would even attempt. A shot made harder by flawed optics. A shot many crews wouldn't try even with perfect glass. Fire. The recoil blasted through the Firefly. A heartbeat passed. Then another. A small bright bloom appeared on the Panther's turret ring, followed by a thick pillar of smoke jetting from its loader's hatch. The shot had penetrated. The Panther stopped moving. Then the turret sagged. Inside the cupola, Aldridge exhaled shakily. Harper. That shot. But there was no time to marvel. German infantry had begun regrouping around the southern hedgerow. Machine gun teams deployed behind fallen half-tracks. Mortar rounds thumped in the woods, probing for the Firefly's position. Radio intercepts crackled with warnings. More Panthers spotted near the river crossing. Another platoon possibly entering the valley within minutes. Mac's voice trembled only slightly. Sir, we're one tank. We can't hold against a counterattack. Aldridge lowered his binoculars, eyes narrowing. We can't withdraw either. If their armor breaks through this ridge, they'll hit our infantry brigade at St. Martin while they're redeploying. We're the only gun up here with the range to stop them. Harper kept scanning. Smoke, movement, shadows forming shapes, the battlefield shifting like a tide he alone could read. Finch touched the next shell. Sir, how many AP rounds do we have left? Mac checked the ammo rack. 5. Maybe 6. Aldridge nodded once slowly, grimly. Then we make everyone count. Harper's eyes returned to the sight, the misaligned reticle wavering, the heat haze bending the valley, the next wave of German armor forming at the tree line. He whispered not to the crew, not to the tank, but to himself. Come on then, because he knew the final fight of the ridge was beginning, because 7 tanks wasn't the end of the story, because the valley had not yet surrendered, and because a gunner with a flawed sight was about to face the hardest shots of the entire battle. The smoke that hung over the valley had thickened into a grey shifting curtain, broken only by the orange flicker of burning wrecks scattered across the fields. The hillside trembled with distant detonations. The air once cool now tasted of charred oil and hot steel. Inside the Firefly, the world had shrunk to the creak of metal, the rasp of breathing, and the thud of Harper's gloved hand on the traverse wheel as he shifted to meet whatever emerged next. 3 AP left, Mac said, voice tight but steady. Finch wiped sweat and grime from his brow with the back of his sleeve. 3 shells, and they're still coming. Aldridge didn't answer right away. He stood in the hatch profile, dark against the shifting light. The brim of his helmet glowed faintly when fire flared in the distance. He lowered his binoculars, slowly, deliberately, as if forcing himself to accept what he saw. 2 tanks, he said, both moving north of the village road. One looks like a Panzerroman 4, the other, his voice thinned, might be another Panther. Harper heard the words, but he didn't feel fear. Not now, not after all they'd survived. His hands rested on the sight as though it were an old companion. Through its cracked glass the valley warped and rippled, but he saw every movement with clarity born of exhaustion and instinct. Finch loaded another shell, the heavy brass casing sliding into the breach with a ringing metallic clunk. Up in, Harper steadied his breath. A burning breeze brushed past the turret opening. Voices drifted from the field's German calls, urgent, strained. The survivors of the earlier assault were gathering. The valley was still alive with danger. And yet somewhere deep within Harper calmness settled. They had held so far, they would continue to hold. Driver Aldridge said, angle us 10 degrees right. Keep the hull low. The Firefly shifted again, treads grinding softly against chalk and dirt. Harper felt the subtle change, the turret now facing a narrow gap in the hedgerow where the next attack would come. And then he saw it. Beyond the torn foliage, a Panzerroman 4 crawled into view, turret seeking targets. Its commander scanned the ridge with a pair of binoculars, unaware he was already under the gaze of an enemy gunner who had spent the entire morning mastering a broken sight. Harper adjusted the reticle. The misalignment had grown worse, still so distorted now that the horizontal line looked almost bowed. But Harper didn't need the line, not anymore. He used the scratches around the lens, the shimmer of heat, twist the lean of the turret ring. The Firefly's damage had become his advantage, its flaws memorized, its drift predictable. Target acquired, he said quietly. Send it, Bill. Harper fired. The Firefly kicked like a living thing. The shell streaked through the smoke and slammed into the Panzer's upper hull. Flame burst instantly through the hatch. The tank lurched sideways, tracks locking as the crew desperately scrambled clear. The engine roared in its death throes, then died with a metallic cough. 8 Finch whispered as though afraid to break the spell of the shot. But Aldridge lifted a hand, silencing him, eyes front, the other ones moving. Harper was already shifting. Through the haze a darker shape pushed past the burning wreckage. The silhouette was unmistakable, long-sloped armor broad turret. A panther pushing cautiously, learning from its predecessor's fate. It emerged slowly, keeping its front plate angled. Hull-down position, smart, experienced. This crew had survived firefights before. They knew how to hunt fireflies. "It's seen us," Mac said. The Panther's gun swung toward the ridge. Harper aligned the sight, compensating, almost blind now, the reticle's drift so severe that he used the absence of the crosshair's center to judge his aim. "2 rounds left," Finch said softly. Harper didn't reply. He needed silence, stillness. He felt the valley itself fade. No smoke, no burning metal, no shouted orders, only the faint hum of the Firefly's engine beneath him and the heartbeat thrum in his ears. He fired. The Panther's mantlet sparked. The round skidded upward, ricocheting off the thickest part of the armor. Loader, Harper snapped. Finch already had the next shell halfway to the breech. He slammed it in, breath ragged. Up. Aldridge's knuckles were white around the cupola rim. "Bill, this is our last AP," Harper knew. He breathed in slow and steady, holding the breath in his chest. He adjusted the reticle farther left than ever before, higher than instinct demanded. "Come on," Harper whispered. The Panther's gun lowered. The 2 tanks stared across the valley, predator and prey, though neither knew which was which. Harper exhaled and fired. The Firefly almost tore itself off the ridge with recoil. Smoke flooded the turret. Harper fought to keep the sight in view as the haze cleared. A single bright flare blinked on the Panther's turret ring, then another. Then the turret burst upward, a plume of fire ripping through its center. The Panther rolled backward, engine still running for several seconds until flame choked it silent. Aldridge lowered his binoculars slowly, almost reverently. 9 tanks. Mac whispered, "Dear God." Finch slumped against the ammunition rack, exhausted. "We're out of AP." Harper didn't look away from the sight. He scanned the valley, burning metal, abandoned guns, shadows falling back toward the tree line. No more armor moved. Aldridge took one long breath. "We bought them time. The whole brigade. St. Martin will hold now. For the first time since dawn the Firefly fell still. Truly still. No engine rumble, no shouted orders. Not even wind, just the crackle of distant fires and the soft settling of metal cooling." Harper leaned back from the sight at last. The lens was warped beyond repair. The reticle burned faint in the center. Its flaws, the distortions, the scratches, the drift had somehow guided the day's most improbable string of long-range kills. Finch sat quietly, hands trembling. Mac climbed partially out of the hatch, gulping the warm air as if it were a reprieve from drowning, and Aldridge placed a hand on the Firefly's turret ring. "Bill," he said, voice low, "you held this ridge with a sight we should have replaced weeks ago." Harper shook his head. "No, sir, I didn't hold it. We did, because a tank was never one man. It was a crew, a single living organism made of trust, fear, skill, and the thin metal walls between them." Reflection. When reinforcements finally relieved the ridge, the battalion's officers paced among the burned hulks in stunned silence. 9 tanks destroyed, a broken sight, a gunner whose aim had no right to succeed and yet did. Some called it luck, others called it skill. The truth was likely both, fused by the pressure of a single morning in Normandy. The Firefly's crew stayed together until war's end. Harper never grew fond of that flawed sight, but he never forgot it either. For in its warped glass he had learned something simple and immovable. Perfection isn't what wins battles. Determination does, courage does, and sometimes, just sometimes, so does a man who refuses to let a flaw become a weakness. The ridge remained quiet afterward. Grass grew over the craters. The farm walls were rebuilt. But for a few hours on that June morning, one Firefly tank stood alone against a valley of steel and did not break. A reminder whispered through time that even on the worst days of war, one steady hand can change the fate of many.